The quietest horrors are the ones that sleep beside you. A stranger in the night can terrify, but there is something far worse about betrayal that wears the mask of love. A husband's voice, gentle in the dark, can soothe or destroy. His promises may be the chains that bind you, or the trap that leads you into silence. When lies drip into a marriage like poison, they spread until the air itself tastes bitter, until the home you built together feels like a tomb. And when the truth comes crawling out, it doesn't arrive softly. It arrives like a knife pressed against the skin of everything you thought was safe. Tonight, I'm going to take you through 10 true liar husband horror stories. Each one is a wound that never healed. Each one proof that the people we let closest are often the ones who can hurt us the most. If you find yourself holding your breath, if the shadows in your room seem to stretch longer after these stories, then leave a like for me by liking this video. Share it so the warning can spread, and subscribe so you'll never face these long nights alone. Story 1, The Locked Basement. Clara Thompson had been married to Richard for nearly a decade when she began to feel the unease she couldn't name. He worked as an accountant, the kind of man everyone trusted, the neighbor who waved at children, the husband who smiled politely at barbecues. To friends, he was ordinary, dependable, harmless. But Clara had lived with him long enough to notice the details that others never saw. The late-night phone calls he always took outside, the way he locked the basement door and pocketed the key, as if guarding something more precious than their marriage. The way his smile tightened whenever she asked what kept him up so late at night. On the night the storm rolled in, thunder shaking the windows and rain hammering the roof, Richard called to say he'd be working late. Clara should have felt relief. Instead, she felt pulled toward the basement. The air down there was cold, heavy with damp earth. The concrete walls slick with a faint film of moisture, and at the far end stood the door. The padlock gleamed, water stains dripping like dark veins beneath it. She had found the key weeks earlier in the pocket of his old coat, and though she told herself she would never use it, tonight her hands moved on their own. The lock gave way with a soft click, and the door groaned open. The smell hit her first, metallic, sharp, tinged with mold. A bare bulb swayed from the ceiling, its weak light spilling over shelves stacked with journals. Dozens of them, each labeled by year. She pulled one down, her fingers trembling. Inside was Richard's handwriting, but what she read made her skin crawl. Page after page cataloged her life. Not their life together, but hers alone. Every phone call she made, every store she visited, even thoughts she had whispered to herself when she thought she was alone. He had written about testing her, about lying to see her reaction, about setting small traps to measure her loyalty. The pages dripped with obsession, with hunger disguised as devotion. Clara dropped the book, her breath ragged, while burning her throat. That's when she heard the basement door close behind her, the soft creak of wood, the finality of a lock sliding into place. She turned, heart hammering, and Richard was standing there. His coat dripped with rain, his eyes calm in a way that terrified her more than rage ever could. "I told you never to open that door," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only certainty, as though she had stepped onto a path he had always known she would take. He stepped closer, and the bulb above flickered, throwing his face in and out of shadow. Clara realized then that Richard's lies had never been about work, or about where he went late at night. The lie was a life itself, the husband she thought she had, the man she thought she knew. And now, in the basement that reeked of mold and iron, she wondered if she would ever see the light of day again. Story 2, The Disappearing Nights. Emily Carson thought she had married a man of routine. Her husband, David, always went to bed at 10, always kissed her forehead, always whispered the same words before the lights went out. Good night, sweetheart, sweet dreams. He never strayed from that ritual. But in the second year of their marriage, Emily began to notice something strange. When the house settled into silence and she drifted toward sleep, the mattress would lift just slightly, the weight of David's body leaving. The sound was delicate, barely a shift in air, but it repeated night after night. By morning, he was always there beside her, snoring lightly as if he had never left. At first, she dismissed it as imagination. Maybe she was dreaming, maybe stress from work, was warping her sense of time. But then she began waking in the early hours, the clock glowing 2:13, 2:29, 2:41, and finding the other side of the bed empty. Sometimes she heard faint movements below, floorboards creaking, the soft scrape of a chair against the kitchen tiles. She never confronted him directly. She simply asked in passing, "You sleep well last night?" And David would nod, smile, and say, "Of course." His lie was casual, seamless, but it carved something cold inside her. One night, Emily followed. She waited until he slipped out of bed and padded quietly behind him. The house felt different in the dark, as if its walls held their breath. David moved to the den, where he kept an old desk. He didn't turn on the light. Instead, he sat perfectly still in the armchair, his face angled toward the window. The glass reflected nothing but his silhouette and the faint glow of street lamps outside. He didn't move for minutes, for hours, until Emily thought she might lose her mind from the waiting. Then, very slowly, he began whispering. She strained to hear, pressing her back against the cold hallway wall. The words were faint, choked, as if he were speaking through tears. Names she didn't recognize. Pleas for forgiveness. Descriptions of things Emily had never lived through. Fires, blood, screams in the night. It was like listening to a confession. But to who? To the window? To the darkness beyond it? Her skin crawled as she realized he wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to someone he believed was there. When the whispering stopped, David turned his head, his profile catching the glow. And for the first time, Emily noticed something that froze her veins. His mouth was still moving, but the reflection in the window wasn't. The shadow of her husband smiled when he did not. Its lips curled wider, sharper, until the glass seemed to ripple with teeth. Emily stumbled back, the floor groaning under her weight. David rose instantly, his head snapping toward the sound. In that moment, she knew two things with terrible certainty: that her husband had been lying about where he spent his nights, and that whatever he was communing with was no secret he had control over. It owned him, and now perhaps it had seen her too. Story 3. The Hidden Room. Marissa Powell adored the old farmhouse her husband James had bought for them. Its creaking staircases and slanted windows gave it character, a sense of history. James told her it had been in his family for generations, though he never shared much about that lineage. He laughed off her questions, saying the past didn't matter, only the future they were building. But every time he walked down the narrow hallway on the second floor, Marissa noticed how his eyes flicked toward the far wall, just beside their bedroom door. A glance too quick to be casual, too weighted to ignore. Months passed before she worked up the nerve to investigate. She tapped along the wall late one evening while James was away on a supposed business trip. Her knuckles struck hollow at one spot, the sound deeper, emptier than the rest. Her pulse raced. With shaking fingers, she pressed her ear against it and heard something she couldn't explain. Not the hum of pipes, not the scuttle of rodents. Breathing, steady, patient, waiting. Marissa pulled back, bile rising in her throat. She told herself she was imagining it, stress creating monsters. But the next day, curiosity overpowered her fear. She searched the basement and eventually found a rusted tool set, along with an old crowbar. By afternoon, she had pried the boards loose from the hollow section of the wall. Behind it was a door in her own home, hidden behind plaster and paint. Its surface was scarred, as if fingernails had dragged against it again and again, begging for release. Her hand trembled as she turned the knob. The smell that poured out was suffocating. Rot, mildew, something sour that clung to her clothes. Inside, the room was small, more like a cell. Chains bolted to the wall. A filthy mattress in the corner. And scratched into the wood again. And again was a single word: liar. Marissa stumbled back, her lungs burning. Her husband had never mentioned this room, never explained its existence. And yet it was here, waiting for her. That night, James returned home, his smile as warm as always. But when she confronted him, when she whispered that she found the room, his face changed. Not with shock, not with denial, with resignation. As if the lie had finally unraveled, and he no longer had the strength to keep it bound. He stepped closer, his voice low, his eyes unreadable. "You weren't supposed to find that," he murmured. And as he reached out to brush the hair from her face, Marissa felt in her bones that she had stepped into a story much older than their marriage. A story built on chains, secrets, and the kind of lies that do not let go until they've taken everything. Story 4. The Vanishing Bank Account. Samantha Avery trusted her husband Ryan with the household finances. He was good with numbers, steady, practical, the sort of man who always had a plan. At least, that's what he wanted her to believe. She had never once checked their account balance herself, never once doubted his explanations when he said a bill was higher this month, or when he told her they'd have to wait to afford something small she wanted. He said he was saving for their future, for their children, for the life they'd always dreamed of. But late one night, when Ryan fell asleep on the couch, Samantha caught the glow of his laptop screen. A bank statement sat open, long rows of withdrawals, amounts that made her head spin. Tens of thousands gone, moved in increments, hidden in shadows. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled, her throat tightening when she saw the description for each transfer. Payments to names she didn't recognize. Private rentals in cities they had never visited. Hotels, clubs, cash. She backed away, the room tilting around her, bile rising in her stomach. Her husband wasn't saving for their future. He was spending on a life she had never known, with people she had never met. The lie wasn't about money alone. It was about who he truly was when the sun went down. The next morning, Samantha asked him gently, testing the waters, "Ryan, are we okay financially?" He smiled, kissed her cheek, and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Better than ever." His eyes never wavered. His voice never shook. The ease of the lie cut deeper than the truth itself. From then on, every time he left the house at night, Samantha wondered if he was slipping into that other life. And every time he smiled at her in the daylight, she wondered if she was staring into the face of a man who had already replaced her in every way but one. Her body, still standing in his home, still believing she belonged there. Story 5. The Widow's Discovery. After her husband Michael died in a sudden accident, Laura Brennan mourned deeply. Friends brought casseroles, neighbors offered condolences, and Laura drowned in the silence of a house that no longer echoed with his footsteps. In her grief, she clung to every memory, every photograph, every voicemail. She told herself that at least she had known a good man. But grief has a way of opening doors you never meant to touch. Weeks after the funeral, Laura began sorting through Michael's office, drawers crammed with receipts, notebooks, and file folders. At first, it was busy work to distract her from the crushing loneliness. But then she found a box pushed to the very back of the closet. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bound in ribbon. They weren't addressed to her. They weren't written in her handwriting. Laura's hands shook as she untied the ribbon. The letters were from another woman, one Michael had been seeing for years. They spoke of secret trips, of promises he had made, of lies he had told to cover his absence. Laura's stomach twisted as she read about nights when she thought he'd been working late. But instead he had been in another bed, in another life. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was a realization that everyone she had told about her perfect husband, every smile, every story, had been built on a lie. She wasn't a widow of a good man. She was a widow of a liar, a stranger she had never truly known. And now she was left to mourn a ghost that had never really existed. Story 6. The Forest Cabin. Heather and Kyle often took weekend trips to a remote cabin in the woods. It was their escape, their private place, where no one else could find them. Kyle had chosen the location himself, telling Heather he'd stumbled on it years before, that it was owned by a friend who rarely used it. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? But during one trip in late autumn, Heather noticed something odd. A set of photographs pinned to the wall behind a cabinet, hidden from plain sight. They were old, curling at the edges, but she could make out faces in them. Faces of women, different women, standing in front of the same cabin, smiling stiffly, their eyes never quite meeting the camera. None of them was her. Her blood turned cold. When she asked Kyle about them, his reaction was instant, too quick. He laughed, said they came to the cabin, just relics of the past. But his voice was too high, his hand too tight on her shoulder. That night, Heather lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Kyle's breathing slowed beside her. Every creak of the wooden beams felt like a warning. In the dark, she couldn't stop thinking about the other women. Who were they? Why had they been here? And why had he lied? The cabin no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a trap, one she hadn't realized she had walked into until it was too late. Story 7, the second phone. Rachel Morgan was cleaning the laundry room when she found it, tucked inside the pocket of one of her husband Daniel's jackets. A phone, not his usual one, not the device she saw him use every day. This one was smaller, older, without a case, with a battery that hummed when she held it. At first, she thought it must be a work backup, but when she pressed the button, the screen came alive and messages filled it. Hundreds of them. They weren't work contacts. They weren't family. They were conversations with women she had never heard of, each message dripping with intimacy. Each one proof that the man who kissed her goodnight had been whispering the same words to others. Her throat closed, her chest tightened. Her body felt cold and hollow as she scrolled deeper and deeper. Pictures, promises, lies. That night, she placed the phone on the dinner table, its screen glowing under the light. Daniel walked in, set down his briefcase, and froze when he saw it. For the first time in their marriage, Rachel watched his face drain of all pretense. He opened his mouth, searching for words, but the silence between them was louder than any excuse. The phone was the voice of every lie he'd ever told, and it left no room for denial. She didn't need to ask how long. She didn't need to ask why. All she knew was that she had been sharing her home, her body, her life with a stranger who had built a second world out of shadows. And now, the walls of her own house felt closer, suffocating, as though the lies had soaked into the wood itself. Story 8, the empty crib. Melissa Green had wanted a child for years. Her husband Thomas always told her to be patient, always said the timing wasn't right, always smiled as though the future was already written for them. When she finally became pregnant, she thought the waiting was over. She prepared the nursery, painted the walls a soft yellow, placed a crib by the window that caught the morning light. But when she went into labor, Thomas wasn't there. He said his work had kept him late, that traffic had trapped him, that fate had been cruel. He arrived hours after the birth, smiling too brightly, holding her hand as though nothing had gone wrong. She forgave him because she wanted to, because love makes forgiveness easy, even when it shouldn't. Weeks later, in the deep of night, she woke to the sound of footsteps. She padded down the hall and froze at the nursery door. Thomas stood over the crib, but the crib was empty. His hands rested on the wooden frame, his shoulders trembling. He whispered words Melissa couldn't understand, a language not his own, syllables that sounded broken and raw. When she stepped closer, he spun around, his face pale, his eyes wide. "There was never a baby," he said, his voice hollow. Melissa's breath caught. She looked into the crib, her chest tightening, her skin crawling. The blankets were smooth, untouched, as though no child had ever lain there. She stumbled back, her mind unraveling, memories twisting. The pain of labor, the cries she swore she had heard, the tiny weight in her arms. Were they real, or had her husband built a lie so thick it swallowed her whole? Story 9, the neighbor's warning. Olivia had always loved her neighborhood. The families were close-knit. The children played together in the streets, and everyone waved as they passed. When she married Henry, she was excited to bring him into that world. At first, everyone welcomed him warmly, but over time, Olivia noticed the way conversations would falter when Henry approached. The way smiles froze, eyes glanced at one another, voices lowered. One afternoon, her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Daly, pulled her aside. Her hands shook as she held Olivia's wrist, her eyes heavy with something darker than pity. "Be careful," she whispered. "You don't know him." Olivia laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the words clung to her like cobwebs. That night, she asked Henry if he had grown up around there, if he had known any of the neighbors before they met. He smiled too quickly, too smoothly. "No," he said, "they must be confusing me with someone else." The lie was neat, but it frayed at the edges. Days later, Olivia found an old photograph in the town's archives. tucked into a display at the local library. A group of young men, standing by the very houses she walked past every day. And there, at the edge of the frame, was Henry. Younger, yes, but unmistakable. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the caption beneath. A note about a tragedy that had struck the neighborhood decades earlier. The disappearance of a girl. The suspects never charged. The men who had been questioned but never confessed. When she brought the photo home, Henry saw it in her hands before she spoke a word. His smile didn't falter this time. It vanished altogether. And in its absence, Olivia saw the truth she had been living beside, a lie so carefully constructed that it fooled even the people who still carried its scars. Story 10, The Locked Journal. Julia's husband Nathan was a writer. At least, that's what he called himself. He filled notebooks with words he never shared, pages he kept locked away in a desk drawer. He said it was private, unfinished work, something she wouldn't understand. Julia respected it at first, until the night she heard him whispering the words aloud. His voice carried to the thin walls of their small house, low and fervent, as though he were reciting prayers or curses. When Nathan left for a trip, Julia's curiosity overcame her. She found the key hidden under his pillow and opened the drawer. Inside were dozens of journals, each one filled cover to cover. She expected fiction, drafts, ideas. But what she found made her blood freeze. They weren't stories. They were records. Pages upon pages detailing their marriage, but twisted. Arguments that had never happened. Affairs she had never committed. Children they had never had. Dying in ways too gruesome to put into words. Every page was a lie. A future that didn't exist. A past that never happened. But Nathan wrote them as though they were truth. As though he had lived them. Julia's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her throat closing as she read the final line of the most recent entry. She will read this soon. And when she does, the story ends. The sound of the front door creaking open jolted her upright. Footsteps crossed the threshold. Julia's chest heaved as the keys slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. Nathan's voice drifted through the hallway, calm and steady, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. You weren't supposed to open that drawer. The journals lay open on the desk, the lies bleeding into the air around her. And Julia realized then that Nathan's stories weren't just words on paper. They were plans. And the last one, still unwritten, was meant for her.